This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com, continuing with the discussion of John Salza's errors on Sedevacantism and a refutation of his article on the issue. In the last section, I was discussing his primary distinction and how it is completely refuted by Pope Paul IV. He distinguishes between, number one, the fact that we all agree on, that heretics lose their offices without the need of any further declaration, ipso facto. But he claims, number two, we need a declaration from the Church to know if someone falls into this category where he has lost his office without declaration. I quoted Pope Paul IV in his bull, Cum ex apostolatus officio, who teaches not only, number one, that a heretic cannot assume the office of bishop or pope because he's not a Catholic, but he also teaches, number two, that Catholics can identify and reject this individual as a heretic without any declaration. And that fact destroys Salza's primary distinction and, in fact, his whole article, because his entire article is built on this distinction. Now I want to discuss more in this regard. It's clear that Pope Paul IV contradicts Salza and his argument. But the same is true of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, because, as we already mentioned, and he admits, Canon 188.4 contains this principle of the divine law, that those who publicly defect from the faith lose their offices without declaration. Now, what's so interesting about this is in this Canon 188.4 of the 1917 Code, which incorporates this principle on heretics losing their offices without any declaration, it has a footnote in the Code of Canon Law. If you consult the Latin version, you can see footnotes for many of the canons. Not every single canon has a footnote, but a lot of them, to show where in tradition or where in past papal teaching they're getting these ideas from. Is it a papal bull or a council or something else? And the reference for Canon 188.4 of the 1917 Code is to Pope Paul IV's bull, Cum ex apostolatus officio. That shows that the two are in harmony. And while it's true that the bull of Pope Paul IV is more expansive on a Catholic's ability to recognize the heretic without a declaration and reject him, Canon 188.4 necessarily teaches the same thing, because both of them include the same core principle that heretics lose their offices without declaration. And Canon 188.4 cites Pope Paul IV's bull, and it's completely unreasonable to believe that the 1917 Code and Canon 188.4 are contradicting Pope Paul IV while quoting him and repeating the core principle of his bull. Are the non-Sedevacantists, including Salza, going to argue that Pope Paul IV does in fact teach that a Catholic can recognize and reject a heretic before any declaration has been made, as is indisputable? But the 1917 Code of Canon Law teaches exactly the opposite, even though it quotes Pope Paul IV's bull for its teaching on this matter. By incorporating the principle of the divine law, that heretics lose their offices without any declaration, and giving a reference to Paul IV's bull, it's very clear that the 1917 Code is reiterating the traditional principle made explicit in Pope Paul IV's bull, that number one, publicly heretical claimants lose their offices or cannot assume them without any declaration, and number two, such heretics can be recognized and rejected by Catholics. Moreover, as already covered, number one is pointless unless there is an actual application of number two. Furthermore, a true understanding of this principle, number two, that Catholics can also recognize the heretic without a declaration, is perfectly consistent with St. Robert Bellarmine's teaching on this matter. The quotes from St. Robert Bellarmine on this topic are somewhat well known at this point, and it's rather remarkable that Salza would not only so clearly contradict Bellarmine but the teaching of the Church when he says the following, quote, "It should go without saying that the required declaratory sentence must be given by ecclesiastical authority, Matthew 18:17, Titus 3:10 Of course, nothing in either positive law or divine law permits just any Catholic individual or group to issue declaratory sentences and ecclesiastical censures, nor does the law permit Catholics to licitly resist a duly elected pope in the absence of these required ecclesiastical adjudications." End quote. This is an astounding error. He says that there's nothing in Catholic teaching or the divine law that allows Catholics to reject a man who purports to be the Pope, unless there's a declaration. Salza not only directly contradicts Pope Paul IV and the traditional teaching of the Church, but also the well-known quotations from St. Robert Bellarmine, who simply explains what the Church has always taught on this issue. St. Robert Bellarmine, in his work on the Roman Pontiff, says, "For in the first place it is proven with arguments from authority and from reason that the manifest heretic is ipso facto deposed. The argument from authority is based on St. Paul, Titus 3:10, who orders that the heretic be avoided after 2 warnings, that is, after showing himself to be manifestly obstinate, which means before any excommunication or judicial sentence." End quote. So he directly contradicts Salza, who says you must have a sentence. Furthermore, he directly contradicts Salza on his understanding of Titus 3:10 and the other scriptural passages. And what Salza does not understand and corrupts is that a person can refuse to hear the Church not only by resisting an actual declaration from a living member of the Church, but also by refusing to submit to the already established rule of the magisterium. As Pope Leo XIII teaches in Satis Cognitum, the practice of the Church has always been the same. The Church has always held as outside Catholic communion those who would depart from the authoritative rule of the magisterium. That is refusing to hear the Church. You don't need a declaration. So if someone's rejecting Catholic teaching from the Council of Trent, etc., he's refusing to hear the Church. He is showing himself to be obstinate, as St. Robert Bellarmine explains, before any formal excommunication or judicial sentence. So Salza blatantly contradicts what Bellarmine says on this as well. And it should be noted that what St. Robert Bellarmine says is in reference to a man who claims to be the Pope. So he obviously teaches that a so-called Pope who is clearly heretical can be recognized and rejected without any declaration. And there's an even more precise and devastating quote I'll get to later, which further refutes Salza and his fellow heretics. Now that we quoted that, I think it's worth asking, is it likely that St. Robert Bellarmine and Pope Paul IV, who both definitely contradict John Salza, that's beyond dispute, also directly contradict the 1917 Code of Canon Law on the matter of a Catholic's ability to recognize a heretic without any declaration, principle number 2, while being perfectly in harmony with the Code on the related issue of loss of office without any declaration, principle number 1? Or is it more likely that John Salza has misunderstood and misapplied the canons he thinks teach a declaration is always necessary for a Catholic to recognize and reject a public heretic? It's obviously the latter. Salza has distorted and misapplied the canons he uses, as I will show very clearly. And so we have Pope Paul IV, Bellarmine, clearly teaching that you can recognize that someone has lost his office without any declaration. We have the Code teaching that they lose their offices without any declaration, citing Pope Paul IV. We also have the argument from reason that number 1 would be pointless without number 2 if you couldn't recognize it. It's undeniable what the Church teaches on this issue. With that said, let's move on to Salza's massive distortion of various canons of the 1917 Code of Canon Law. And you will definitely want to stay tuned for when I get into his astounding contradictions.